All right, I think we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian running for U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. Trying to just keep up and do the weekly live stream. There's always plenty going on in the world, so and certainly here stuff for us to talk about and maybe even some questions if we're lucky. So, excuse me, let me close up a couple things over here and just kind of dive in, man. Obviously we've got the, let me see, I guess something I'll throw in here, a couple things. For starters, I finally got around to putting another written blog on the website, so if you're not subscribed over there and you haven't already seen it, after this, go take a look. The URL's over here, obviously, on the screen, so you can just take a look there, and take a look, man. Try to cover a few of the big things. The title is "Government at Its Worst: War and Inflation." So I think we'll. It's pretty self-explanatory, but obviously those are two of the big things that are really hitting us up now. Let's see. In addition to that, I wanted to throw out this Saturday, since I got invited, I'm going to be out on Saturday at Taste of Oviedo. The Oviedo is the way the locals say it. I have trouble bringing myself to say it that way. But this is over in Seminole County. The LP of Seminole County is going to have a table over there, so I'm going to be a part of that. Let's see what else. If you happen to be in the Jacksonville area, there's also a great event being put on by Eric Parker out there. He's one of the three guys we have running for Jacksonville City Council, three good libertarians. Him, Tubb, and Ron Tracy Robinson, my good buddy from the Flexit debate. So if you happen to be up in the Jacksonville area instead of closer to where I'm at, go check them out. I think that's a little bit later in the day. Maybe I'll post the details. I know I've posted it already. Yeah, I heard Volusia County was doing something as well. We'll see. We'll see if I can sneak around to get anywhere else. But I don't know about it for this weekend. So, but that's a couple of events. I'll be trying to come out and still looking for some more things to get out to, but not too many things nailed down just yet. But that's one thing for this weekend. So if you happen to be in Central Florida, please, by all means, come out and join me. Let's talk. Let's see. But yeah, and I guess I should add it in for anybody who's listening, or if you're on the other live stream. In Port Orange, I know Libertarian Party of Volusia County's got a booth. I don't know what the event is, but I know that they're going to be out there. Joe Hanush, candidate for U.S. Congress, is going to be doing petitions there. So go out and join those guys if you happen to be in that area instead. So let's see. What other fun stuff? I mentioned my recent blog post. I shouldn't say it's fun stuff because it's not really about fun stuff. Inflation and war obviously is not, and where we're at with both of these things is at a pretty terrible place. Besides all the wars that are still sort of continuing in the background, we've kind of got them on mute here in terms of the media and everything else. But in terms of what is in the forefront is obviously the conflict in Ukraine and where we stand on it. There's actually something really good I wanted to... Actually, you know what? I'll just go ahead and jump into that now. There was an article I recently came across. This is actually an article from 1998. It was, let me see, from the New York Times. I heard this mentioned. If you haven't listened to it, Scott Horton appeared on what's the guy's name? Jocko... I don't know I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but the Jocko Unraveling podcast. Go listen to Scott Horton. It's a really long appearance there. And one of the things I heard mentioned was this article where it was an interview with a guy named George Kennan, who was and I have posted this link to this on I think all of my social media, but it's an article, excuse me, an interview where he's talking about, this is in 1998, about the beginning of NATO expansion, and as just what an absolute mistake it is and how wrong it is. There's a few parts in there that really stood out to me, but just that whole perspective that here's a guy, who was like ambassador to the Soviet Union, was a diplomat during that era, I think going back to the 1940s. So really one of the guys who was behind the whole policy of Soviet containment. The event in Volusia County is Bruin Food Festival in Port Orange. So if you happen to be in that area, go check that out. Support Joe and the other folks over there as well. But yeah, coming back to this, I'm just going to read a couple little bits from this because I found it really fascinating and insightful. This is he's being interviewed by a guy, Thomas Friedman, who I think usually kind of speaks on the side of the neocons, but obviously this is before the neocons really blew up in sort of what they were doing in terms of the early 2000s. This is, again, it's from 1998. In sort of describing what was happening, the Senate's ratification of NATO expansion. I think it's it's the beginning of a new Cold War. And he continues, I think it's a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We've signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. A couple other bits in here. I was particularly bothered by references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we're turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Further on he says, let's see, it shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history, of course, that there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia. Excuse me, let me read this a little more clearly. Of course there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that this is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. This is something that really stood out to me, in particular because it is basically what's happening now. Right now, everybody who is talking about the whole issue of NATO and Ukraine as it relates to NATO in particular are trying to essentially use this particular event and I think some of the other sort of reactions in the past. They're taking this and saying, well, look, of course, who wouldn't want to be a part of NATO? Look what Russia's doing. This is who Russia is. They invade and they do this and they do that, with no sense of context. But it's being predicted even back here in 1998 that this is what's going to happen. We're going to do this. We've embarked on this policy, and it's going to provoke a bad reaction. And once it provokes a bad reaction, they're going to say, well, look, this is exactly like we told you. I heard it likened to kicking a dog repeatedly until the dog bites you, and then saying, look, what a bad dog it is. You should have done worse to him. Something along those lines. And it's interesting when you see it from the perspective of folks, particularly folks back in the day who had the perspective from the Cold War, to understand what was happening then and the nature of U.S. involvement in these kind of interactions, in these kind of events with other countries, and this whole sort of general meddling in the affairs of other nations. We have not stopped doing it, and it is not just at our own risk, but at the risk of the people there. Because I think that's something that at least some of us are picking up on, is that, again, obviously the real victims here, the victims getting the worst of it are the Ukrainian people who are caught in the crossfire. Nobody's suffering more, but the question is, how do you get them out of that, and what's the best way to do that, if that's your highest priority? Again, one of the other things that obviously should be a high priority for us is to not escalate the situation into a direct conflict with the U.S. and Russia, which obviously then has the potential to escalate into a nuclear conflict, because it is one of the few times where you have two nuclear powers, and not just two nuclear powers, but the two nations with the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. There's obviously quite a bit of danger in creating that situation. It's something we managed to avoid throughout the entire Cold War. Again, the Soviet Union, like was mentioned there, fell without a single shot being fired. And as I said, instead of responding to that by in a more positive way, which I think maybe seemed that way early on, and maybe that was just because we were able to exert a little more influence in their politics, with folks like Boris Yeltsin. But whatever the reason, obviously we've decided to take, particularly as it relates to NATO expansion, a more antagonistic approach towards them. And this is the fruit that it bears, conflict. And again, these other folks get hung out to dry because they're the ones who have to suffer the consequences. It's not just their lives at risk, but also their homes, their communities being destroyed. And it is the worst of the worst, Well, certainly I can talk about a lot of other things that government does, which are terrible and awful, and that maybe have a broader set of, what's the word I'm looking for? Broader set of people who are being affected, just because this is so localized, it's in this one country, although it is across that entire country now. But it's different for us who are so isolated from it that we don't feel the brunt of that. But obviously it is the worst, the most terrible thing government can do, killing innocent people or putting people in a situation where this is going to happen, contributing to it, creating the circumstances for this to happen. So it's something we don't want to do. It's something we want to change the policy. That's why we want to get rid of the folks who have been, in the driver's seat for all these many years, for the last 30 years, for the last 100 years, really, that have created this predicament. But in particular, the last 30 years, who have sort of set us down this path of inevitable conflict, and just kept trying to push those buttons and see how far they could push those limits. And obviously, you can't go that much further than the borders with Russia itself, unless you really want to do that. But, it's part of what worries me the most about this thing is having a little bit of insight, just from a bit of reading and listening to folks who've done a lot of studying on the subject. Our foreign policy establishment has done an absolutely terrible job in a multitude of ways, but pertinent to this, I think, is the fact that they wrongly predict the outcome of and the consequences of any of their actions, and again, the consequences, the negative consequences of an invasion to Iraq or Afghanistan are somewhat, well, I don't want to trivialize any of what's been lost and the consequences suffered, but it's obviously at a different magnitude when you talk about conflict with a nuclear power. So a question: how can we help your campaign? There's the two obvious things. If you can either contribute your time and effort by volunteering, or if you can contribute financially. We're trying to go about this based on the way Florida election law is, and really what is the most feasible mechanism for doing this, going to qualify by the qualifying fee, and obviously trying to run campaigns to go statewide and spread this message. It requires a certain amount of resources. I remember the first time I met Justin Amash and got to ask him a question about what could we learn from the two old parties. The thing he told me was there really wasn't that much. Really what it boiled down to was just they have more resources. And so we really need to be able to get those kind of resources ourselves. It obviously makes a difference in a lot of different ways. I don't expect that we need to compete with them dollar for dollar. I think the message we have is better, and people do want to hear something different. They need to get a lot of boxes checked for themselves. They need a certain amount of comfort with it, but they need to hear it. Before anything else, they need to hear it. If they never hear the message, or they only hear it in a context that they're not willing to listen, it's something that they need to be convinced that this is really out there and at the same level as what they're up against. And so that's why it's so important for us to get it out there. So all of that can be done right here on the website at misigoy.com. There should be the links at the top. If you're looking at a desktop, it'll be on the top right, or it'll be just at the top if you're on a mobile browser. but you have options to contribute. There's a donate button. I believe there's a volunteer button, so you guys can do that. And, again, whatever you can support offer makes all the difference in the world. It's, like I say, makes all the difference. So, enough going on about old Cold War guys foreseeing this kind of conflict. Speaking of old foreign policy bureaucrats and stuff, Madeleine Albright passed away this week. And if you've never seen the clip, just to get a little bit of perspective, there's a great clip. You can find it on YouTube. It's not even 30 seconds, I don't think, but it's from a 60-minute interview. Tell you everything you need to know about this right here, and these kind of people's values. They ask her, and this is in the 90s. This isn't even involving the second Iraq War. So this is after the first Iraq War during the Bush senior years. This is the Clinton years. She's the Secretary of State in the Clinton years. We have these sanctions and no-fly zones. And she's asked a question, is because at that time it's estimated that about 500,000 children, 500,000, 500,000 children have died due to these sanctions. And she's asked the question, is that worth it? And, just coldly, she's like, we think that, the price is high, but we think it's worth it. And, it's baffling to me when people are able to take that perspective and really, but I guess you kind of have to be detached from humanity to really, the regular sort of day-to-day kind of humanity to believe that. Because what was it worth? What was the potential of that 500,000 children, 500,000 Iraqi children? I think maybe the estimate might be a little, the real number might be slightly lower, but you're still talking about hundreds of thousands of innocent children dead because of sanctions to try to punish a dictator who ended up getting ousted anyway. So, but by a war later, not because of the sanctions. The sanctions accomplished nothing but killing those people. And so, what was it worth? What did it accomplish? This is the thing. When you pursue whatever sort of goal is you're trying to pursue, and you pursue it through these sort of awful means, not only do you tend to do all this other awful harm and destroy the lives of people who had nothing to do with it, you also have a tendency to, what's the word I'm looking for? You don't even accomplish the thing you set out to do. And this goes beyond just foreign policy. I think it's actually more, it manifests itself more in these kind of do-gooder domestic policies. But even here, nothing was really accomplished by this but massive human suffering. And it reminds me also right now, similarly to after we left Iraq, after the first Iraq War ended, the war in Afghanistan ended last year in a certain sense, but we currently have these sanctions, and we have, in particular, I believe it's a significant amount of the assets of the central bank in Afghanistan are frozen, and because of that, they don't have a functioning banking system in Afghanistan. It's made commerce incredibly difficult. There's probably other sanctions I don't have like a full list or a full awareness of on top of my head, but it's producing another humanitarian catastrophe. Okay, and just to get you an understanding, I saw this number and it was kind of mind-blowing to me. Over 13,000, I think the number was 13,700 newborn babies dying just this year. Okay, so just January, February, and now in March. We're not even done with March. Over 13,000 newborn babies dead. And the causes are basically malnutrition and other hunger-related diseases. These seem like should be preventable stuff we can avoid for newborn. We can't provide, what's the word I'm looking for? You can't prevent every kind of disease, and obviously in the world, there's a lot to be said about some of the challenges with that and things that require special kind of medication or other sort of conditions where people are exposed to certain things. But you're just talking about hunger. You're not even talking about really like the miracles of modern medicine that you need. You're just talking about people having enough food. And people having enough food to then be able to provide for the most vulnerable. mothers nursing newborn babies. It's, that's a human cost. And when I hear anybody try to defend that, I can only shake my head. Because to me, that sort of policy that sacrifices human life in that way is really indefensible. And to achieve what and for what purpose? Again, for whatever we may feel about the Taliban and the way that they do things in Afghanistan, which, so what? You punish these people for it? And again, really the main thing the Taliban did to us is just refuse to submit to the government we put in there. First with Hamid Karzai, and then with Ghani, Ashraf Ghani, whatever. The puppet government that evaporated in a week after the U.S. left. And the Taliban took over Afghanistan after 20 years and $2 trillion of investment and all of this gone in an instant. So there's that. All right. What else do we got? We've got a Supreme Court justice hearing. I did find it, although it was I haven't followed this one quite as closely. Just not as much of a life or death for me. It seems like I don't want to get it wrong. Well, I'll stick with Judge Jackson. I think Ketanji, is it Brown Jackson? Okay. I thought it was interesting. There was one of the sort of exchanges where she was being questioned, where it related to a previous filing she had done as a I don't know if it was as a defense, well, in her career as an attorney, and she was given some grief about having called President Bush and I believe Secretary Rumsfeld. We're talking about W. Bush the second. So referring to them as war criminals or accusing them of war crimes. And, the only real negative I have to say about her on that regard is just, why didn't she double down on it? I guess she's playing the game. I understand what it is. But it really would have gotten a lot more respect from me if she had done that rather than just kind of play it off and be like, I don't remember what case that is and this and that. It's unfortunate because, like what I'm talking about with Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and a lot of these events that have caused immeasurable amounts of needless human suffering, all stuff that could have been prevented. There was no reason we needed to go into Iraq. There was not an imminent danger of what's the word I'm looking for? Weapons of mass destruction, be they nuclear or of any other sort. There was no evidence coming later in the form of a mushroom cloud, as Bush and Condoleezza Rice and these folks used to like to say. None of that was happening. And in the same way, in Afghanistan, after 9/11 happened, within a month or so, the Taliban were offering to hand these guys over. And you can go and look it up, and I post the article every sort of time when it comes up in a conversation. Every kind of conversation where it deals with the whole start of the war in Afghanistan is the fact that the Afghans, they were willing to hand these guys over. They were willing to hand over Bin Laden and al-Zawahiri and all these guys, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, all these guys to the U.S. They wanted a little bit of a process. They wanted to negotiate, and obviously they didn't want to have their country destroyed. But obviously we chose, or I shouldn't say we chose, but our government, our leaders, Bush in that particular case, chose war, chose conquest instead of trying to just get the people responsible and leave it at that. Think of how much different it would be if we didn't embark on this course that we've gone on. We talk about, imagine if all that money was directed towards soil and seeds. Here's the thing. I don't know what's necessarily the thing where that money should have gone, because really at the end of the day, if you think about it, our national debt at that time was less than $5 trillion, I think. Obviously today it's at $30 trillion, but even going into 2020, at the beginning of the year, I believe the national debt was only at about 22 trillion, maybe close to 23. Only. And all that money is money taken away from the people. debt that we've been put under as they've overspent, and obviously also inflated the currency. We're feeling the effects of that right now, in particular with how it went into overdrive during COVID. But the point is not even for government to take the money and then invest it in this, that, or the other thing. Let the people decide how they want to invest it. And there's a lot of people, obviously, who are going to want to do soil and seeds and a lot of the research on food production and things like that. But there's other people that are going to spend their money in other ways, and it's all good. This is that's part of how freedom works. It's part of how the free market works. And if we simply got out of the way, we could get that efficiency. We could get that production, and we could improve the quality of life for so many people. But other folks would rather have their hand in everything. And unfortunately, and obviously when it comes to war, you're talking about really diverting all these resources to this kind of work, to this kind of ends, and really which is just destruction. It's great for the folks who make a living off of it, but for the rest of us, not quite so good. The tyrants and oligarchs choose to use government to send young Americans to kill or be killed in a sovereign country at a taxpayer expense. Yeah. We pay for it, and then we pay these other folks to provide all the materials for it, all the weapons and all this and that. And it's good for them to have the war machine rolling, It can't be overstated enough, that warning that Eisenhower gave in his farewell address about the military-industrial complex. It's always funny when you bring that topic up. For a lot of people, they hear that term, the military-industrial complex, and they think, well, conspiracy theorist. But that term was coined, at least to the best of my knowledge, by a sitting U.S. president on his way out. So I think he knew what he was talking about. And I think he gave a warning, and I don't think we've heeded it in the slightest. Certainly would not be exemplified by our military budget, particularly when you compare it to some of these other countries. And in particular, coming back around to that first, the constant big story right now still being the invasion in Ukraine. When anyone tells you that Russia is about to go into these other countries and this and that, you've got to just give people a little bit of focus, and particularly if anyone even throws out the thought of Russia trying to come here, just a little bit of a comparison, and I don't have it handy to throw up on the screen right now, but one of these charts that shows the military spending by country, the U.S. is up here at 760 some odd trillion, billion, 760 billion, give or take, and how you're counting it and everything that you're including. But the last NDAA for this year, fiscal year 2022, approved over 760 billion, so more than $750 billion. Meanwhile, Russia's military spending is estimated at around 60-something billion. So less than a tenth, less than 10% of what we spend is what they spend, because they don't have it. Okay, their economy is comparable to like the size of New York State or the size of Italy. They're not in any position to do this kind of stuff, and the folks who want to keep pushing this, they're I don't know if they're actually living in a fantasy land, or they just want you to be living in a fantasy land when they throw this stuff out. I'm sure there's some people who believe this in earnest, but at the end of the day, it's wild. It's out of touch with reality, and we need to focus on reality, and rather than be wrapped up in the propaganda, we need to be logical and be thoughtful and consider the cost and the consequences of any of these kind of actions. And that's about the biggest thing I can say about it. I'm going to wrap up because I'm at about time here. I guess I started maybe a minute late or so. But thank you guys for joining me. I'll be back on next week. Like I said, this Saturday at least I'll be out at the Taste of Oviedo in Seminole County. Libertarian Party Seminole County is going to have a table out there, and I'll be joining them there. If you happen to be there yourself, come out and join me. And what else? I'll be back next week. If you, like I said, also if you haven't, go check out the the latest blog on the website, and what else? That's under the news link when you go, if you're on the web page, if you're going from the home page, go to news. I should probably label some of these things a little differently. But also, last week I was on the Kelly Patrick show podcast. You can find it on Spotify and some of the other platforms. Go look that up. I'm on episode 499. Really cool because I got to be the next political guest after Scott Horton. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. You can listen to my conversation with him. It's audio only, but still all good. And I'm going to leave it at that. Talk to you guys again next week, if not sooner. And yeah, let's make this happen. Thank you.